I'd like to introduce today Dr. Edward Donnerstein. He's a professor of communication, and from 2002 to 2009, he was Dean of the College of Social and Behavior Sciences at the University of Arizona. Prior to his appointment at Arizona in 2002, he was the Roop Chair in the Social Effects of Mass Communication and Dean of Social Sciences at the University of California, Santa Barbara. A social psychologist, he received his PhD in psychology in 1972. He held appointments at the University of Wisconsin, as well as visiting positions at the University of Lethbridge and Beijing University in China. His major research interests are in mass media violence, as well as mass media policy. He's published over 220 scientific articles in these general areas and serves on the editorial boards of a number of academic journals in both psychology and communication. He was a member of the American Psychological Association's Commission on Violence in Youth and the APA Task Force on Television and Society. He recently served on a Surgeon General's panel on youth violence. He served on the Advisory Council of the American Medical Association Alliance's Violence Prevention Program, and is past president of the International Society for Research on Aggression. In addition, he was primary research site director for National Cable Television Association's $3.5 million project on TV violence. He's testified at numerous governmental hearings, both in the United States and abroad, regarding the effects of policy implications surrounding mass media violence and pornography, including testimony before the United States Senate on TV violence. He's served as a member of the United States Surgeon General's panel on pornography and the National Academy of Sciences subpanel on child pornography and child abuse. And basically, he's had invited presentations all over the world, and for the American Pediatrics Association, for various broadcasting agencies. And welcome him today to talk on children and media violence.
Thank you very, very much. I'm using a PC here, and I'm a very, very strong advocate of the Mac commercials. Unfortunately, what they didn't tell me when I bought this new Mac is that the adapter to hook up had changed. So I'm going to be very gentle in this PowerPoint, or we're in lots of trouble, and hopefully it will work. It's a pleasure to be here, and it is actually more of a pleasure to no longer be a dean. After 15 years, 7 or 8 years here, and 7 or 8 years at the University of California, freedom is great. And sort of stepping down and retiring, not completely retiring, but stepping down and back to academia is a great, great feeling. My brother, up until last year, was practicing here in pediatric cardiology, and when he retired, I saw the smile on his face, and I figured, good direction to go, as it turns out. I'm going to talk about lots of material. The handout has a number of publications that I am more than happy to send you. In fact, there are 2 websites. I'll put this on right at the end. It's also on the handout which you have. The first one is the Kaiser Family Foundation, which has lots of information on adolescents, children, and the media, plus adolescents and health. If you've gone to their site, it's kff.org. If you go to kff.com, I'm not sure if it's a porn site or what you get, but kff.org will work just fine. I'm going to mention some of their research, and we've been involved in some of the research they have done. There are some updates to a number of their national surveys, which will actually be out in a month or so, and I'll mention them when I get to the current data, because it will change in another month, and some of that is embargoed. The other great site to go to is me, which means I'm more than happy to send you this presentation, send you any PDF, send you any article, anything you would want, just email me, and the chances are, within an hour or so, I'll have it back to you. So really feel free to do that. There's also an article, let me refer you to, that'll be out in February in Pediatrics by a good colleague of mine at University of New Mexico, College of Medicine, Vic Strassberger, Amy Jordan from Annenberg Penn, and myself. on sort of a general overview of mass media and health effects. And media violence is just one or two paragraphs in the entire article. There are discussions of sexuality, advertising, obesity, a whole host of issues which we think are important, particularly regarding children and adolescents' exposure to mass media, with a whole set of recommendations, primarily to physicians, to practitioners, to the industry, and to parents. Again, happy to send it to you in its proof form. There's another article, again, happy to send to you, which I think is a fairly good overview of the media violence issue. Goes back a few years, but it was a special issue after the Surgeon General's report on violence in youth that we put together. And it overviews, I think, a lot of the theories, a lot of the findings, the meta-analyses, the context of media violence, and what we think as researchers are really the findings. And I highly recommend it. We'll gladly send it to you. There's another article, happy to send to you. It's out of a book by Vic Strasberger, Amy Jordan, and Barb Wilson called Children, Adolescents, and the Media. And it's a chapter on the internet, which I'll get to at the end as sort of a different way of looking at mass media and children. When I was asked to do this a few months ago, and I said yes, and I had just stepped down as dean, so I was saying yes to lots of things, but I always enjoy doing these. When somebody suggests doing a talk, I'll occasionally go through the newspaper and try to find things which refer to the talk, and certainly I did. I'm going to talk about some data of children's viewing habits and how much they view. And surprise, surprise to everybody, you normally ask parents, you normally ask children. There was a recent study which just came out, also in pediatrics, discovering that at many daycare centers, children are watching lots of television. In fact, in this one particular study, up to 2.5 hours a day, in addition to some of the data I'll talk about from Kaiser in a few minutes. We're going to talk about solutions to this issue. Very recently, this past summer, Senator Rockefeller talked about, again, government intervention in trying to curtail violence in the media. I'll get to this at the end. If you're going to wait for any government intervention, you're going to have a very, very long wait. But the topic's always on the agenda. There's also issues of rating systems for video games, for music videos, for film. The FTC, Federal Trade Commission, comes out every year or so with recommendations which basically say the system is not that effective, particularly for children and adolescents. They just came out only a week or so ago with another report to Congress arguing, in fact, the rating system is not that effective. And I'll discuss why also at the end. Anytime you get into this topic, you obviously find data of somebody who imitates somebody else. There was a recent strangulation, a teenager strangling, murdering, allegedly, his brother. And he says he copied and imitated and emulated and identified with a serial killer in a Showtime series called Dexter, which, if you haven't seen, didn't get any Golden Globes, so I can't tell you whether it's good or bad. But I think we find a lot of this. This is to not infer that with or without Dexter, the same thing wouldn't have happened. The mass media plays a role, and we'll talk about what that role is. Internet bullying, which I'll get to, because I want to talk about the internet as another vehicle for dissemination of media, particularly to children and adolescents. And one of the issues which now comes up is internet bullying, even though there is some controversy on whether or not this is the same as traditional bullying. I'll argue, in fact, yes, it is, and we can talk about that right at the end. And there's also now a great deal of work going on in various states to try to deal legally with cyberbullying. And it's a very infamous case in Missouri, which a number of you have read about. And this has become a new phenomenon. And I'll give you some references of where you can go to where I think there's some very, very good research in these areas. We'll talk about video games, aggressive video games, and again, people discussing whether or not children, particularly adolescents, are becoming addicted. A month or so ago in the journal Pediatrics, there was a policy statement And that policy statement dealt with the issue of media violence, and another policy statement happened to deal with music. Let me talk about the American Academy of Pediatrics policy statement on media violence. And their conclusions were no different than many, many other professional organizations. My own American Psychological Association, American Medical Association, and others have said pretty much the same thing. And in this policy statement, the American Academy of Pediatrics made it very, very clear that exposure to media, including television, movies, music, video games, presents a significant risk to the health of children and adolescents. And they call upon pediatricians to really look at sort of the media habits, particularly the media viewing habits of their patients. This is not new. And American Academy of Pediatrics has had previous policy statements, have other organizations on this particular topic, and they all tend to agree. There is a role for the media, not only in terms of aggressive behavior, but a whole host of health issues. When we talk about this topic, let me point out two common themes we need to think about. One is context, and the other is consequences. There's lots of violence in television and film and video games, but the context in which it appears is extremely, extremely important. And the consequences to violent acts is extremely important. There is a big, big difference between, let's say, a Saving Private Ryan film, and I happen to use that one because the first 30 minutes are fairly graphic. So graphic that when it was shown on national television, there was a great deal of controversy about whether or not ABC, in fact, wanted to show it. But you compare that to, a Terminator film. Not that I'm thinking of James Cameron right about now, but there's a difference between sort of fantasy violence and realistic violence and the consequences and the effects which that has on the viewer. And I think that'll become somewhat obvious as we go through this. First question. Do children use the media? Yes. Okay, a great deal of it. This is not the most recent Kaiser survey. The most recent Kaiser survey will be out February 15th. It's embargoed, but I expect the findings won't be that much different. If you're looking at children and tweens, you basically find they spend a great deal of time each day with screen media. People used to talk about television. No, screen media refers to video games, to television, to film, to my iPhone, whatever it is that you're getting information from. In fact, they're spending much more time with screen media than reading, and unfortunately just about the same amount of time as they are in playing. Separate issue altogether. Computer use, probably close to 50%. I think the most recent Kaiser survey will say it's even way beyond that, and we have to wait to February, but I'm quite sure. And about 31% of those under the age of 3 are using computers. In fact, the fascinating thing, if you look at most national surveys on children under the age of 2 using media, some interesting findings. Close to 50% are watching television every day, 25%, and I think the findings will be more, have televisions or some form of screen media in their bedrooms, and about 70% on any particular day are using screen media, television, videos, you name it. Now, if you are part of the American Academy of Pediatrics, I think all of you know their recommendations. For those under 2, no, no, and no. Children shouldn't be watching television or film. That, in fact, there is little or no evidence of any positive effects, including Baby Einstein, separate controversy, separate series of talks. But there's just generally no evidence of any quote-unquote beneficial effects, except for the mom and dad in the restaurant who can put the video there and get a couple of minutes of peace and quiet, I assume. But outside of that, no. Yet I think we're beginning to find that the amount of time being spent by children that age is actually phenomenal relative to where it was years ago. Are children different? And the reason I want to briefly mention that is because when we talk about the effects of media violence, we're talking about the effects on children. You and I can watch all the aggressive film we want. And if there are going to be effects, perhaps the effects might be some transient desensitization. The effects in terms of predicting later aggressive behavior occur in children. And one used to think in the 5, 6, 7-year-old range. Lots of colleagues are now talking about in the 2, 3, 4-year-old range where these effects are beginning to occur. Are children, in fact, different when they view the media? The answer is yes. Younger children, and this audience knows this much, much better than I do, really pay attention to very salient features. They pay attention to perceptual features, not the plot at all. So what the characters look like says a great deal. I have a good colleague at the University of Wisconsin who years ago used to do research with young children, and she happened to use the film, or the television show at that time, The Incredible Hulk. And for those of you who are TV fans, if you remember The Incredible Hulk, this big guy turned into this quote-unquote ugly creature in order to save people and save the world. Well, you and I know that, and we kind of applaud when he turns into the Incredible Hulk. A young child screams. This is an ugly-looking character and doesn't quite see that connection. They also have difficulties with fantasy and reality, as you know, and that's extremely important because we're going to talk about some research which looks at effects. And the effects from media violence are from the viewer's perspective. So if they think it's real, it's real. And more important, there is a real problem of linking scenes, linking consequences which occur later down the line for young children. So if somebody commits an aggressive act and is punished scenes later, you and I say violence doesn't pay, or there are consequences, or something in fact happened to the perpetrator. A young child will not see that at all, and that's going to have significant effects. Let's talk about first media violence, traditional media violence, and I'm going to go through this very, very rapidly, then a little bit about video game violence, a little bit about the internet, and then try to get to some solutions if there are any. United States Surgeon General had a report some years ago on youth violence, and in there were a number of things we all felt very comfortable about in terms of trying to predict aggressive behavior in adolescents and adults. One, individual differences in the propensity to become violent occur very early in life. So we are concerned about 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds in terms of how they are going to develop in terms of their aggressive attitudes, their aggressive behavior, their scripts for behavior, how they manage anger, a whole host of things. And whatever effects are occurring and whatever environmental effects are occurring, there are many of us who strongly believe they do occur very, very early. And for media violence, those effects are going to be the strongest in that sort of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old range. Secondly, the more aggressive child turns out to be perhaps the more aggressive adult. So if you can determine somehow what are some of those factors which go into aggressive behavior at an early age, there's a very good chance you will be able to predict later aggressive behavior. And the most important thing, aggressive behavior, as all of you know, is a function of a whole host of factors, all interacting with each other. So when one begins to talk about media violence, you're just talking about one of those factors which just adds to the propensity and the probability of later aggressive behavior. It's a risk factor, just like many risk factors. In fact, in terms of looking at effect sizes from the Surgeon General's report, for those from the ages of 6 to 11 to look at what would be some of the factors predicting later adult aggressive behavior, the strongest one was being male. Okay? But there are a whole host of others. This is just a subset that I presented. But media violence is one of them. Small, 0.13, but it's a contributor. And there are many contributors to aggressive behavior. And the media plays a role. And the research on this has been consistent for a long, long time. What are some of the known effects? Well, some of the known effects from exposure, particularly in young children, is learning, modeling, learning of aggressive scripts, learning of ways to behave. That can produce short-term effects, but for a lot of social cognitive theorist that produces also very long-term effects that folks can now follow up. Good colleague Raul Usman at Michigan in these longitudinal studies, which have now gone on over 30 years, but there's a whole set of cross-cultural studies that are in the 10 to 20-year range. Learning occurs, and it is carried over. Fear of victimization, and also desensitization, which occurs both in the short term and the long term. Desensitization basically means here sort of less responsiveness to real violence, both physiological arousal, emotional arousal, seeing less violence in the real world, but also some evidence of lowering empathy for victims, which is also a fairly reasonable predictor of aggressive behavior. And there's some interesting research on this. And I'm not going to move the mouse because I'm a Mac user, and if I move a PC mouse, who knows what's going to happen. But here's an example of desensitization. Here's a group of teens who saw some non-violent films, top bar, or saw R-rated violence, particularly violence against women, fantasy violence, film violence, and then over a 10-minute period watched a documentary of an abused woman, real violence. And what do you find? Well, you find that when they're watching this documentary of a real victim of violence talking about her spousal abuse, those who had seen fantasy violence only 30 minutes before show less physiological reactivity. That's desensitization. Okay? It's not a great difference, but they're less bothered physiologically by what they're seeing. And in fact, if you ask them later on, what did they think of the injuries to this real victim? How painful were the injuries? There is also research on looking at rape victims and judging rape victims. You find classic desensitization. Those who have seen quote-unquote fantasy violence now see less injury, less pain. This is sort of standard types of findings in the desensitization area. And again, there's some evidence that carries over to feelings of empathy. Does American television contain violence? Yeah, okay. Lots of television and film contain violence. There have been content analyses over the years. They're always fairly consistent. There was a major project we were involved with some years ago. The findings still sort of stand, where about 60% of programs in a sample of television, broadcast, cable, film channels like HBO, Showtime, about 60% of them have violent acts, and we're defining violence here as intent to physically harm an animate being. So a tornado coming through and killing people isn't going to be called aggression. Does that have an effect on children? Yes. Does verbal aggression have an effect? Yes. But here in these particular content analyses, we're talking about physical aggression in which there is an intent to harm an animate being. 60% of those programs have it. Much of that violence is very glamorized, still glamorized. And what do we kind of mean by that? Well, around 40% of the perpetrators are attractive. Why is that important? Because for a young child, an attractive perpetrator is somebody they identify with. And if you look at the longitudinal study of people like Usman and others, both cross-culturally and in terms of these 10, 20-year follow-ups, identification with aggressive characters is one of the best predictors of later aggressive behavior from watching media violence. So around 40% are attractive. Bad characters, again, somebody the child would say should be punished is not punished around half the time. And around 70% of the time when somebody commits an act of violence, there's no remorse, there's no criticism, there's no penalties. Nothing happens to the person. Now, again, we could argue, certainly down the line, a half hour later or 2 hours later in a particular film, something occurs. But we're talking about from a child's perspective. And making that link is very, very difficult, in fact, to make. A lot of the violence is very sanitized. What do we mean by that? Well, 2/3 of the time, close to that, there's no pain shown to victims. And if there is pain shown, particularly in children's programming, it's very, very unrealistic. This is the holiday season. We used to go ahead and show, I think, The Wizard of Oz. Now I think we show Home Alone 1 and Home Alone 2 during Christmas and Easter. I'm not sure which one. And for those of you who have ever seen Home Alone 2, there's a great scene in there where little Collie McLaughlin, somebody you identify with if you're a kid during the Christmas season, I guess, is sitting on the second floor of a building there with the quote-unquote bad guys, if you remember the film, and he takes 4 bricks and from 2 stories up throws a brick at this guy's head, okay? And the guy falls down. That's great. And little stars go around. And he throws another brick, another brick. He throws 4 bricks from 2 stories up at this person. The person falls down. So there's harm. And the next scene, we don't see a Band-Aid, we don't see a scratch, and the person is running after him. That's kind of unrealistic, okay? And needless to say, if you were hit from 2 stories with 4 bricks, I think you'd be dead. And as it turns out, in about 2/3 of children's programming, that type of unrealistic violence, i.e., no harm or harm that has no bearing in the real world exists. No long-term consequences. People don't suffer. Societies don't suffer. The violence is very, very sanitized. And I should say that these particular content analyses, there's a recent study in Japan that just came out last year looking at Japanese programming and also video games, finding very, very similar types of findings. Very few programs have anti-violent themes. What does that mean? It means nobody really talks about violence. Nobody talks about alternatives to violence. Nobody talks about the consequences to violence. And in fact, maybe 4 or 5% of films or programs will have that. What's a classic example of a very violent movie, but is very, very pro-social in its presentation? Well, Saving Private Ryan. Again, if you've seen the opening scenes, pretty violent. But violence is real. Consequences are there. People suffer. Alternatives to violence are discussed. That's a very, very rare event. And finally, and a little more disturbing, guns are used very, very often in these types of interactions. In fact, in these content analyses, which looked at over 10,000 programs, which is a lot of violent acts, around 25% of the time, a handgun was used to commit the act of violence. That's a lot of gun use. And oh, this is a content analysis of, the question is, I'm supposed to say, what are the years? This is a content analysis of American television over a 3-year period, each year, okay?
Same programs?
No, just a random sample of programs taken every year, okay? And it's about 5,000 programs a year. So guns are used about 25 to 30% of the time in violent interactions. Now, if you sort of think about all this research, and a number of colleagues, along with myself, have, there are certain types of risk composites for children that you can think about, in which the most problematic types of violence are presented, all at the same time. So if you look at all the research and you say, what would be the biggest problem for a young child viewing, there's about 5 things that, if they all occurred at the same time, we'd consider a high risk for children viewing. 1, the perpetrator of the violence is attractive. Why is that important? Again, because a young child will identify with attractive perpetrators. The violence is justified. You hit me, I hit you back. The violence goes unpunished. Nothing happens to the perpetrator. Nobody says anything. There's no criticism. There's no punishment. Nothing occurs. The violence shows no pain or harm to the victim. And the violence seems to be realistic from the perspective of the viewer. Not you and I, as adults viewing this, but does the child see this as realistic? And one of the questions we and others have asked is, where do these types of scenes occur that might be directed at children? And what types of shows have this type of violence? Well, no, music videos don't. Reality shows don't. Duh, they're reality shows. Okay, they're showing realistic violence if they show it at all. Drama, a little. Comedy, no. Again, we're talking about physical acts of aggression. Verbal aggression's a different issue. Movies, kind of. We're sort of missing a good chunk of the pie. They mainly occur in children's programming. as it turns out. So the types of interactions we're the most concerned about tend to occur in exactly the program directed at the audience we're the most concerned about. And in fact, and this is what happens when we switch it to a PC, okay? The child is over here, non-child is here. If you look at children's programming versus adult programming, you'll find that children's programming actually has more violent acts, more programs of violence, more acts per hour, more scenes, and more unrealistic harm than adult programming. So again, the types of things we'd be the most concerned about for young children occur in their programs. And again, this is a transfer to a PC. Child is over here, adult is all the way to the right. So 57% for considered attractive is a child perpetrator. Children are not very often perpetrators of violence on television, so don't misunderstand. But when you find children as perpetrators of violence or a childlike character, they turned out to be more attractive, the violence is more justified, they're less punished, there is less harm, in fact, to victims, and more of these risk portrayals occur. So what can we conclude about some of this research? Well, one, children are exposed to a great deal of violence in the mass media. And there's 30, 40 years of research saying exactly the same thing. The amount and the content has not changed all that much. The dissemination of it has. The context of the violence that is directed at children actually does pose risks. It has the types of things most of the research would say creates a long-term risk. Attractiveness, i.e. identification, no harm, okay? No remorse. The types of things which the research on an individual level would say does occur, when it's all put together in particular types of programming directed at children, you find the effects. And of course, the consequences in which violence occurs and what happens to victims, what happens to perpetrators is extremely important. What about video game violence? Well, one wouldn't be surprised that the effects are not that different, and in fact, probably a little stronger. Why? Well, one of the strongest effects you get with traditional media violence is identifying with the perpetrator. When you're playing, let's say, a video game, an aggressive video game, or a first-person shooter game, you are the aggressor. So the identification becomes slightly easier at this point. There's a good colleague of ours, Craig Anderson. Craig will have a major meta-analysis of all of this research out in Psych Bulletin in February, if I'm not mistaken. You can get a hold of him. He'll send you everything. If you go to his website, all the articles are there. He's done probably some of the most extensive research and analyses of all of this. And there's lots of theoretical reasons why video games, violent video games, would have an effect. More arousing, it's interactive, you are more than identifying with the aggressor, you are, again, the aggressor. And there's a whole host of theoretical reasons why this should occur. If you look at sort of some of the meta-analyses, this is one a few years back, and again, there's another one coming out. You find in these meta-analyses on video game violence that for aggressive behavior, short-term aggressive behavior in the lab, strong effects, hostile affect, strong effects, physiological arousal, aggressive thoughts, fairly strong effects, pro-social behavior, which is sort of a numbing effect, a kind of desensitization, you find less helping behavior, less pro-social behavior after exposure to violent types of video games. I should add, the same thing occurs in traditional media violence, that the desensitization has an effect not only in terms of how you look at victims, but how you look at people who in fact need help. And some fascinating research there. And if you sort of compare all these studies, this is from 2007 that Craig did, if you look at sort of some of these meta-analyses and other studies and look at sort of experimental studies, lab studies, cross-sectional studies, longitudinal studies which have been done a great deal on media violence cross-culturally. There's some newer studies being done on video games. Again, very recent set of studies in Japan. You find pretty much the same effects that you find with traditional media violence, and a number of researchers would argue, in fact, those effects are potentially stronger. Some of the conclusions, well, they're obvious. And I sort of agree with Craig here. They do increase the likelihood of aggressive behavior. There seem to be, at present, no sort of individual differences folks can think about. And it's quite interesting. Most parents, just like with the internet, just like with traditional media, really don't think there are harms. And of course, with video games and also with the internet, which we get to in 1 second, very little monitoring in terms of what is going on. But let me refer you back to Craig's website. You can go there. Lots of great research on violent video games, not pro-social games, violent video games. Finally, what about the internet? Well, the internet creates a totally new medium. It's not a new medium. It's not a new technology at all. So all the things we've been talking about, I have on my iPhone. So I can stream down movies, video games, but there's a whole host of other things that occur that we never really expected, particularly for young children. You're going to see much more severe violence. You're going to encounter hate groups. You're going to encounter things from child pornography to violent types of pornography. And because of its anonymity, it also creates a new type of bullying, which is slightly different, not as pervasive as traditional school bullying, but cyberbullying, in fact, occurs. I never show cartoons, but I got this from my good friend Vic Strasberger, which we have in this book. If you can't read it, it says, "The internet is cool. I can travel around the world before I'm even allowed to cross the street." And quite true. So, in fact, a lot of the Kaiser research would indicate that very, very young children have access to the web, which in fact they should, but it presents a sort of a new dilemma. In fact, if you sort of think about the internet and mass media violence, I have in my iPhone traditional media that I can receive and consume video games, films that I used to see on television, I see now via the net. I also have websites, and websites, as I mentioned, give me the opportunity to not only get traditional mass media, but I can log on to hate groups. There's some great research just came out on neo-Nazi groups and others and how the web, in fact, facilitates real-world behavior amongst those particular groups. And for the first time, you don't have to be a passive viewer. You can send, create, and upload your own content. And finally, we have social networking groups, where there's a whole host of research now coming out, because here you have the ability to create and send aggression, cyberbullying, and of course be the recipient of that type of aggression. So the technology has sort of changed, both in a positive way, and some would argue in a way that sort of creates some problems, particularly for young children. There's a whole issue of the Journal of Adolescent Medicine. Just about 2 years ago in electronic media, there's about a dozen studies in there on cyberbullying, harassment, and other issues. A good piece by my colleague Raul Usman at Michigan about sort of media violence and some of the theories that can account for this newer type of technology having an effect. And I think most people agree. It's an issue, and it's an issue one has to, in fact, look at. If you look at a lot of the research in that particular area, again, as I mentioned, school bullying occurs much more prevalent depending on the study, but depending on the national survey, you get between 10 and 33% of teens claim they're being bullied online. In fact, the most recent CDC report on exposure to violence that just came out a month or so ago said that about 5% of children, young adolescents, in their survey say they were bullied online. 5% in the national survey is a lot of children, period. Okay? And most studies really sit around this 10-15% range. A Pew survey that was done about a year or so ago, and sort of taking some of the data out of that whole Journal of Adolescent Health series, about 15% of teens report private material being sent, threatening messages being received, rumors being spread about them, and even 6% posting embarrassing pictures. Again, those are small percentages, except they're national surveys. So the numbers are actually tremendous, and you're dealing with a much newer technology than traditional media. Let me also indicate that a lot of this research, and all of you are much more familiar with this than myself, that the effects of cyberbullying actually has the same effects in many ways as traditional bullying, school bullying, in terms of self-esteem, lack of interest, depression, and a whole host of things that occur in more sort of interpersonal forms of bullying. The issue of anonymity in all of this is extremely important, particularly for the perpetrator. And of course, one of the things which a lot of researchers have talked about, that all of a sudden now the bullying is occurring not in school, but in places the child would feel the most safe, their bedroom, because it's online, which is much different. There's another group which isn't in the handout. I just added it today, and I should have had it in there. It's the group up in University of New Hampshire, the Crime Against Children Research Center. They're the ones who did the Centers for Disease Control study on children's exposure to violence. They have some great research on sexual predators, children being stalked online, exposure to child pornography, being harassed online. And again, if you look at most of their research, which are, again, national surveys, you'll find that the percentages are low, 5–7% saying somebody, in fact, did try to solicit them sexually. That's a large number of children, okay, 7% as it turns out. Finally, solutions to any of this. Well, government intervention is one, won't happen. Okay, I just bring up Rockefeller again. The government has tried for years to look at ways of intervening in the area of regulation. Keep in mind, the FCC regulates broadcast over-the-air television, not cable, really. And of course, the internet is totally disassociated from all of this. So the ability to regulate through government intervention, almost impossible, and I'm not sure how it in fact can happen. The other possibilities turn out to be either rating systems, which in fact we already have, believe it or not, and critical viewing skills, media literacy. Rating systems have been around for a long time. Most recently, there is the V-chip. There's even a call for a V-chip for the internet. Don't think it'll work. But the current V-chip, believe it or not, if you bought a new television in the last decade, you have a channel dedicated to this V-chip, which you as a parent can set to quote-unquote block objectionable material, certain language, certain dialogue of violence. V stands for viewing, not violence, and certain language. It is quite fascinating. In a recent Kaiser study, another national survey, you find that if you ask parents the meaning of what some of these things mean, like what is V? Well, about 50% understand that V means violence. That's only 50%. If you move down the line to FV, they have no idea that FV doesn't mean family viewing. It actually means fantasy violence. And worse than that, only around 10% of parents understand that a label called EI, which is the thing you really want for your child, that's Sesame Street, educational, informational programming, very few, in fact, understand what the meaning of these particular labels are. And that's probably a moot point, given only around 16%, in fact, even use the rating system or a V-chip. There's a more recent study out last year, and the percentage is up to around 17%. So, in fact, rating systems have not worked. Most parents don't use them. And I should also add, in some of the research we happen to do with Kaiser, my good colleague over here, Dale Kunkel, over in the department, actually discovered that if you look at material that is not labeled V for violence versus the material that is labeled V for violence by the networks, they both have the same amount of violence. There's really little or no difference. So even if you adhere to the particular rating systems, they don't seem to be that effective. And finally, yes, some senators, ex-governors, candidates for Congress or the presidency have actually called for V-chips for the computer. Won't work, hasn't worked. Believe it or not, there is a rating system. If you go into your preference sections for Netscape, Safari, whatever you happen to use, you'll find different types of ratings you can set. But again, Just like the industry rating system, the label is applied by the website and or the particular television show, film, whatever it is. So these particular systems have not worked. And let me put this up once again. Happy to send you all this material because I know I went through things very, very rapidly, including, any of the articles we talked about and others. And let me end it right at this point. And happy to take questions. And I know I'm supposed to say the question back because we're on television or we're broadcasting.